I used to think that ordinary days were the easiest to remember. There was nothing dramatic about them. No important celebrations, no unexpected trips, no life-changing decisions. Just the same streets, the same small house, the same morning routine, repeated so many times that I barely noticed it anymore. I lived alone in a quiet neighborhood where most people knew each other, at least by sight. It was the kind of place where mornings were usually peaceful, where the sound of someone opening a garage door could be heard from several houses away, and where people sometimes left their front doors open for a few minutes while carrying groceries inside. My life had become simple. I woke up early, made coffee, opened the curtains, and spent a few minutes looking at the small garden in front of my house. I worked from home, so I did not have to deal with traffic every morning. Most days, I barely saw anyone before lunchtime. I liked that routine. At least, I thought I did. One Tuesday morning, I opened my front door and found a small bouquet of flowers sitting on the step. There was no note. The flowers were wrapped in simple brown paper and tied with a thin piece of string. They were not expensive or carefully arranged like something from a florist. They looked as though someone had chosen them individually and put them together by hand. I remember standing there for several seconds, trying to understand why they were outside my door. I checked the street. There was nobody nearby. The houses on both sides of mine were quiet. A car was parked across the street, but I could not see anyone inside. There was no delivery van and no envelope underneath the flowers. I picked up the bouquet and carried it inside. My first thought was that someone had made a mistake. Perhaps they belonged to a neighbor. Perhaps someone had the wrong address. Perhaps a delivery driver had simply left them at the first house they saw. I put the flowers into a glass jar and placed them on the kitchen table. By the end of the day, I had almost forgotten about them. The next morning, I noticed how fresh they still looked. There were small white flowers mixed with pale yellow ones, and a few green branches that I could not identify. They made my kitchen look warmer somehow. I found myself smiling every time I walked past them. I still assumed they were a mistake, until the following week. It happened again, another bouquet. This time, there were soft pink flowers and several tiny purple ones. The arrangement was slightly larger than the first one, but it was wrapped in exactly the same brown paper and tied with the same thin string. Again, there was no note. I stood outside my house holding the bouquet and felt something I had not felt the first time: curiosity. I looked around more carefully. Nothing. No one was watching me. There was no obvious explanation. I brought the flowers inside and placed them next to the first bouquet, which had already started to dry. For the rest of that day, I tried to remember whether I had mentioned flowers to anyone. I had not. I did not belong to any flower club. I had never ordered a subscription. I had not recently celebrated a birthday. There was no anniversary or special occasion. There was simply no reason for someone to leave flowers at my door, and yet someone had done it twice. I started paying attention to the mornings. I checked the front step before opening the door. I looked through the window when I heard footsteps outside. I even began waking up slightly earlier than usual. Nothing happened. For nearly 2 weeks, there were no flowers. Eventually, I convinced myself that the second bouquet had also been a mistake. Then, one Friday morning, I found a third bouquet. This one was different. It contained mostly white flowers. They were delicate and simple, with long green stems and small leaves. They reminded me of the flowers my grandmother used to keep in her kitchen. That thought stayed with me. My grandmother had been gone for several years, but I still remembered her house very clearly. The old wooden table near the window, the faded curtains, the smell of fresh bread, and the little glass vases she always seemed to have somewhere around the house. She never bought large arrangements. She preferred small bouquets that looked as though they had been gathered from a garden. I brought the flowers inside and placed them on the table. For the first time, I wondered whether the person leaving them knew something about me. That thought made me uncomfortable, not frightened, just uncomfortable. There is a difference. I was not afraid that someone was following me. I had no reason to believe I was in danger, but I suddenly became aware of how little I actually knew about the people around me. Anyone could have been leaving those flowers, a neighbor, someone passing through the street, someone who had seen me before, someone who knew my routine. I started looking at the bouquets differently. The flowers were always fresh. They were never wrapped in colorful paper. There were never any cards. There was never a signature. And there was something else. They always appeared on Tuesday or Friday mornings. I wrote that down in a small notebook. Tuesday, Friday, Tuesday, Friday. I began wondering whether the pattern was intentional. The next Tuesday, I stayed home. I changed my usual routine. Instead of making coffee immediately after waking up, I sat near the living room window and waited. 7:30, nothing. 8, nothing. 8:30, still nothing. 89. I finally gave up. I felt slightly ridiculous. I went into the kitchen and started preparing breakfast. Then I heard something outside. It was a very soft sound. Footsteps. I stopped what I was doing. A few seconds later, I heard the sound of someone walking away from my front door. I rushed to the window. By the time I looked outside, the person was already at the end of the sidewalk. It was a woman. She looked older than me, perhaps in her late 50s or early 60s. She wore a long beige coat despite the mild weather and carried a small handbag. I could not see her face clearly. She did not look back. I watched until she disappeared around the corner. Then I went outside. There was another bouquet on my doorstep. This time, I did not immediately pick it up. I stood there looking at it. For some reason, I felt that if I touched it, something would change. It was a strange feeling, and I could not explain it. Eventually, I picked up the flowers. The wrapping was the same. Brown paper, thin string. No note. I carried them inside. For the first time, I knew the flowers were not a mistake. Someone was leaving them for me, and now I had seen the person. The strange thing was that the woman did not look familiar. I had lived in that neighborhood for years. I recognized most of the people who lived nearby. I knew the woman who walked her dog every evening. I knew the family with 2 children who always played basketball in their driveway. I knew the elderly couple who planted roses along their fence every spring. But I had never seen this woman before. At least, I did not think I had. That afternoon, I started asking myself questions. Why flowers? Why me? Why now? And most importantly, why did she never leave a note? I considered waiting outside the next Friday, but something inside me told me not to. Instead, I decided to let the mystery continue. The following Friday morning, there were no flowers. I checked the doorstep 3 times. Nothing. I felt disappointed, which surprised me. I had spent several days thinking about the woman, and now that she had not appeared, I realized how much I had wanted to see her again. The next Tuesday, there were flowers, the same brown paper, the same string, but this time, there was something else. A small dried leaf had been placed underneath the string. It was an ordinary leaf, brown around the edges, green in the middle. I almost threw it away. Instead, I kept it. I placed it inside the notebook where I had written the dates. I did not know why, maybe because I had started to believe that every little detail mattered. Over the next few weeks, the bouquets continued. Some were bright, some were simple. Some contained flowers I recognized, while others had plants I had never seen before, but there was always the same wrapping, and the woman always appeared to leave them when I was not looking. I became familiar with her routine. She never stayed for more than a minute. She never looked around. She never approached another house. She came directly to mine, placed the flowers on the step, and walked away. I began watching her from behind the curtain. I never went outside. I never tried to stop her. Part of me wanted to know who she was. Another part of me was afraid that knowing would somehow destroy the strange comfort I had begun to associate with the flowers. Because something unexpected was happening, I was beginning to look forward to Tuesdays and Fridays. those days felt different. I woke up with curiosity. I opened the curtains more carefully. I noticed the morning light. I noticed the weather. I noticed the sound of footsteps outside. The flowers had become a small part of my life. And then, one Tuesday morning, something happened that changed everything. There was no bouquet on my doorstep. Instead, there was a small cardboard box. It was old and slightly worn. It had no address. No name. No label, just a piece of brown paper wrapped around it and tied with the same thin string. I stood there staring at it. For the first time since the flowers had started appearing, I felt genuinely nervous. I knew that whatever was inside that box was not accidental. Someone had left it specifically for me. I carried it inside. I placed it on the kitchen table. Then I sat down. For several minutes, I did nothing. I simply looked at it. The flowers had always felt like a mystery, but this box felt like an answer, and I was suddenly not sure that I wanted to know the question. The woman who kept leaving flowers on my door. Part 2. I sat at the kitchen table and stared at the box for several minutes before opening it. Inside were several small objects. An old photograph, a faded blue ribbon, a small silver button, a dried flower pressed between two sheets of paper, and underneath them was a folded piece of cream-colored paper. I picked up the photograph first. It showed 4 children standing in front of an old house. The photograph was faded, but the house immediately caught my attention. I knew it. It was my grandmother's house. I turned the photograph over. There was a date written on the back. From more than 20 years earlier. I looked at the children. Again, one of the girls had dark hair tied into 2 braids. I did not recognize her. Then I noticed the writing beneath the date. It explained that the girl had spent several summers at my grandmother's house. I felt confused. I had never heard about her. I unfolded the cream-colored paper. It contained several names written in my grandmother's handwriting. Her name was there. Then I saw my own name. I stared at it for a long time. The paper was clearly old, which meant my grandmother had written my name years before I ever knew about the woman leaving flowers. I began searching through the box more carefully. The small blue ribbon looked strangely familiar. I remembered my grandmother keeping things like that in old wooden boxes. She never threw away small objects that carried memories. Then I noticed an old envelope. It was empty, but a date was written on the front. It was the date of my 13th birthday. That birthday suddenly came back to me. My grandmother had baked my favorite cake that year. I remembered her kitchen, the garden outside the window, and the feeling that everything was peaceful for one afternoon. But I also remembered something else, a girl with dark hair. The memory was vague, almost like a dream. I could not remember her name. That afternoon, I looked through my childhood photographs. Eventually, I found the same house, the same garden, the same wooden bench, and in the background were the same white flowers that had appeared in several of the bouquets left at my door. I began to wonder whether the flowers had been chosen deliberately. The following Friday, I decided to wait for the woman. I stayed inside and watched through the window for almost 2 hours. Nothing happened. Then just after 9 in the morning, I saw her, the woman in the beige coat, walk slowly toward my house. She carried another bouquet. She placed it on my doorstep and stood there for a few seconds. She looked at my house as though she was remembering something. Then she walked away. I waited until she disappeared before going outside. The bouquet contained white flowers and several tiny blue ones. They looked exactly like the flowers from my grandmother's garden. I knew then that the woman was connected to my grandmother somehow. I just did not know how. That weekend, I drove to my grandmother's old neighborhood. The house was still there, although it looked completely different. The garden had changed. The wooden bench was gone, but behind the house, I noticed the old storage building I remembered from childhood. I had never been allowed inside. As I stood there looking at it, I noticed a small stone beside the fence. A flower had been carved into it, the same flower that appeared on the pendant my grandmother had given me when I was 13. I had never understood the meaning of that symbol. Now, I began to suspect that it was connected to the girl in the photograph. When I returned home, I searched through my grandmother's belongings again. Inside an old wooden chest, I found a small notebook. It was filled with short notes about people and events from her life, and there, several pages in, was the name I had been trying to remember, Elena. My grandmother had written about a girl named Elena who had spent several summers at her house. She had loved the garden, she had loved flowers, and she had become very close to me. I suddenly remembered sitting on the grass beside her. I remembered her making a small flower crown for me. I remembered a blue ribbon. The memory was still incomplete, but it was becoming clearer. My grandmother's notes also explained that Elena's family had eventually moved away. Years later, Elena had written to my grandmother. She had become a florist and still remembered those summers. She had remembered the garden, she had remembered the flowers, and she had remembered me. I read the letter several times, then I understood the woman leaving flowers was not a stranger, she was Elena, but I still did not know how she had found me, and I did not yet understand why she had chosen to return after all these years. The answer came the following Tuesday. I saw her walking toward my house again. This time, I did not stay behind the window. I went outside. She stopped at the end of the path. For the first time, I saw her face clearly, and somehow, even after all those years, I recognized the girl from the photograph. She was Elena. She placed another bouquet on my doorstep. This time, I knew that the flowers were not simply flowers, they were pieces of a childhood memory that I had forgotten, and she had come back to help me remember. I read the sentence on the back of the photograph again, then I read it one more time. It was difficult to understand at first because the handwriting had faded over the years, but the meaning was clear enough. The girl in the photograph had spent several summers with my grandmother. Her name was Elena. She had been the daughter of a woman who lived nearby, and during a difficult period in her childhood, my grandmother had taken care of her. That explained the photograph. It explained the blue ribbon. It explained the flowers, but it did not explain why the woman I had seen outside my house was bringing everything to me. I kept looking at the photograph. Elena was smiling. My grandmother was standing beside her with one hand resting gently on the girl's shoulder. I had never seen that photograph before. I had never heard her name, and yet somehow I felt that I remembered her, not clearly, just a feeling, a small memory hidden somewhere beneath years of ordinary life. I closed my eyes and tried to think back to my childhood summers. There were fragments. My grandmother's garden, a wooden bench, the sound of a bicycle passing on the street, the smell of freshly cut grass, a little girl with dark hair. I suddenly remembered something. I had been about 8 years old. I remembered sitting on the grass while my grandmother was planting flowers. There had been another girl nearby. She was older than me. She had dark hair tied into braids. She had shown me how to make a small flower crown. I had completely forgotten about her, or perhaps I had simply forgotten that she had a name. The memory was so faint that I could barely trust it, but it was there. I looked at the photograph again. The girl was Elena. The woman outside my house had been connected to her. I just did not know how. The next morning, I decided to find out. I went through everything my grandmother had left behind. For years, I had kept most of her things in boxes without opening them: old clothes, books, kitchen items, photographs, letters. I had always told myself that I would organize everything eventually. That day finally came. I spent hours sorting through the boxes. Most of what I found was ordinary, but then, inside an old wooden chest, I discovered a small notebook. The cover was worn and the pages were yellow. It was not a diary. It was more like a collection of notes, dates, names, small memories, lists of things my grandmother wanted to remember. I turned the pages slowly, and then I found Elena's name. There were several pages about her. My grandmother had written about the summers Elena spent at her house. She had written about how shy the girl had been, how much she loved flowers, how she used to sit in the garden for hours. She had also written about Elena's mother. Her life had apparently become very difficult after the end of a long relationship. She struggled financially, she struggled emotionally, and my grandmother had quietly helped them. She never talked about it. That was exactly the kind of person she had been. She helped people without telling anyone. Then I found something that made me stop. My grandmother had written about me. She had described one particular summer, the summer when I remembered the girl with the braids. According to her notes, I had become very attached to Elena. I followed her around the garden. I wanted to copy everything she did, and one afternoon, Elena had made a small flower crown for me. I remembered that now. The memory returned more clearly. I remembered sitting beside her. I remembered laughing. I remembered my grandmother taking a photograph, and I remembered something else. Before Elena left that summer, she had given me a tiny blue ribbon. I had forgotten it completely, but the ribbon was now sitting inside the box on my kitchen table. I held it in my hands. It was the same ribbon. Suddenly, the flowers no longer seemed mysterious. They were connected to a childhood memory I had lost. But I still did not understand why Elena was sending them to me now. I kept reading. My grandmother had written that Elena eventually moved away. Her family left the neighborhood. They lost contact. Years passed. Then there was a final note. It had been written much later. My grandmother had apparently received a letter from Elena after many years. I searched through the boxes until I found it. The envelope was old. Inside was a single letter. I read it slowly. Elena had remembered my grandmother. She had written about the garden, about the flowers, about the summers she had spent there, and she had written about me. She remembered the little girl who followed her around. She remembered making the flower crown. She remembered giving me the blue ribbon. She remembered that I had cried when she left. I had no memory of crying, but apparently I had. The letter explained something else. Elena had become a florist. She had spent most of her adult life working with flowers. She said that every time she arranged white flowers with small blue ones, she thought of my grandmother's garden. That was why she had sent flowers to my grandmother every year. I had no idea. My grandmother had never mentioned it. Then I reached the final page of the letter. Elena had written that she hoped she would one day be able to return to the neighborhood, but she never knew whether my grandmother was still there. The letter had been sent several years before my grandmother died. Apparently, they had lost contact again. I sat quietly for a long time. Then I understood something. The flowers had not started appearing because of my grandmother's death. They had started appearing because Elena had finally found me. But there was still one question. How had she found my address? I did not have to wait long for the answer. The following Tuesday, the woman appeared again. This time, I was waiting outside. She walked slowly toward my house. She carried a bouquet of white and blue flowers. When she saw me standing there, she stopped. For a moment, neither of us moved. I recognized her face. She was older than she had been in the photograph, but I could see the girl from the photograph in her eyes. It was Elena, the woman who had spent those summers in my grandmother's garden, the woman who had been part of a memory I had forgotten. She placed the flowers on the doorstep, then she took something from her handbag. It was a small photograph. She held it out to me. I looked at it. It showed the same garden. My grandmother was sitting on the wooden bench. Elena was standing beside her, and I was sitting on the grass wearing the flower crown she had made for me. I had never seen the photograph. It was one of the missing pieces of my childhood, and suddenly I understood why Elena had brought the flowers. She had not been trying to frighten me. She had not been trying to make me curious. She had been trying to bring back a memory that belonged to both of us. The strangest part was that she had not expected anything from me. She had simply wanted me to remember. I kept the photograph. I kept the blue ribbon. I kept the dried flower. And I kept every bouquet she had left. Some of them eventually dried completely. I placed them inside small boxes and labeled them with the dates, not because I was afraid I would forget again, but because I wanted to remember how strange it had felt to receive something so simple and slowly discover the story behind it. A few weeks later, I visited my grandmother's old neighborhood again. I stood outside the house for a while. The garden looked different. The wooden bench was gone. The house had new windows. The walls had been painted, but the white flowers were still growing beside the fence. I realized that some things disappear while others remain quietly in place. People leave, houses change, gardens are rebuilt, memories become weaker, but sometimes something small survives: a flower, a photograph, a ribbon, a name written on an old piece of paper. And sometimes, those small things are enough to bring an entire part of your life back. I used to think that the flowers were being left on my doorstep because someone wanted to tell me something. Now I understood that they had been left there because someone wanted me to remember something. And there was another lesson I took from the whole experience. We often believe that the important moments in our lives are the dramatic ones, the big celebrations, the difficult decisions, the endings, the beginnings, but sometimes the memories that stay with us are much smaller. A summer afternoon, a garden, a handmade flower crown, a blue ribbon, a child sitting in the grass beside someone she would not see again for many years. I had forgotten all of it until someone came back and reminded me. The last bouquet arrived on a quiet Friday morning. It was smaller than the others. There were only a few white flowers and 3 tiny blue ones. This time, there was no box.no photograph.no mysterious object, just the flowers. I placed them in the same glass jar where I had kept the first bouquet. Then I put the jar near the kitchen window. The sunlight came through the glass and made the water sparkle. I stood there for a moment and looked at the flowers. For the first time, I did not wonder who had left them. I knew, and I no longer wondered why. Some people enter our lives for years, others stay only for a season, but that does not mean their presence disappears completely. Sometimes a person can leave your life and still leave something behind: a memory, a kindness, a small gesture, something that waits quietly for the right moment to return. For me, it was flowers, and every time I see white flowers mixed with little blue ones now, I think of my grandmother's garden, a girl with dark braids, and a summer I thought I had forgotten. I used to believe those flowers were a mystery. Now I think they were a reminder. A reminder that some of the most important parts of our lives are not lost. They are simply waiting for us to remember them.